Hey guys, it's Lou. I like reviewing and critiquing games, and I will be covering Trails from Zero. To summarize combat, Trails is a turn-based grid system. You can attack, use arts, and crafts. Arts are your magical ability determined by orbs which you set in your character that give you buffs. Crafts are based on a special meter called CP, which gives you special moves the more you hit your enemy. If some enemies cast arts, you can also impede them with a certain craft to cancel it and do damage. Maxing out the meter, CP allows you to do a special S-Craft, which can be activated at any time to earn a bonus or finish an enemy off before they move. Combat is not comparable to the Trails series, which is to say, it improves on the system so much that it changes the way the game is played. To add to that, many of my criticisms that I had on the past games have also been solved now, combat-wise. First, the combat complements each other nicely. Party setup is amazingly designed, and along with the increased enemy toughness or health, the game is completely changed. For one, you have 2 melee attackers and 2 ranged, with one TO being an AoE one. Enemies also no longer have a displayed weakness, which means you have to use the craft Analyze from TO to nerf and find the description of the enemy simultaneously, since you obviously won't always have your crafts up, and will no longer be viable to gate spam the same ability to kill enemies without thinking off the bat like the older Trails games did. Crafts are also fantastically unique, such as Randy being able to blind enemies with his craft all around him for 5 turns, but costs a lot of CP. Trails from Zero also introduces a mechanic which every time you miss an attack, grants a counter for the defender. This is combined with Lloyd's craft on strengthening melee attacks by 25%, which is a fantastic synergy. From Zero seems to also replace chain attacks with small individual AoE attacks. I'm thinking this change was made because of how using a chain attack combined in Trails made you lose all of your members' turns if they participated, and now instead it works as a bonus on a certain turn. Crafts, instead of almost always being an all-out attack, is more specific. For example, Lloyd has an attack on one character, Randy an AoE, Tio has a line-directed craft, and Ellie can AoE heal for, of course, their first S-crafts. Clearly adding more requirements like being in range and in a certain direction for the craft to be activated. This makes it more strategic, and the fact that you move with a party that has to make all these S-crafts function together with the positioning feels really good. And clearly is a change in party synergy compared to its predecessor. As for the benefits of enemy toughness, Zero gives turns to status effects, which helps keep track of enemies and make use of your moves more strategically based on how damaged your team is. Thankfully, they also added status effects that offer lingering damage like burning and poison. So unlike in Trails, inflicting a status effect on an enemy or on your own team isn't synonymous with death, as the last game's focus on Petrify, Freeze, Faint, and Confused, effects which all take away control from the player. However, what this game doesn't solve is the Petrify. In fact, it's built in to inconvenience you. Petrify now just paralyzes foes, though it still one-shots you, which in my opinion should be the opposite way around. Once again, look at this clip. A big downside of the Trails games is the overuse of the guard, or immunity for a 1-turn art, and the enemy spam, which would make you spam Earthquake, or a large AoE over and over. The fewer enemies and larger spells being less viable because of enemy health and the amount of EP it costs eliminates these problems, especially the Earthguard move, which now is dedicated to one special S-craft. I can't emphasize enough how much this completely changes the game, as I'm not kidding when I say the entire game in the Sky Trilogy revolved around Earthguard, and God forbid the AoE Earthwall spam. Finally, though it goes without saying, more HP means more tactics for positioning and arts. Not only does this apply to TO's Analyze ability, which I mentioned earlier, but applies to managing other moves and buffs to stay alive. This is because enemy variety and actions are excellent in Zero. Enemies can dive in and damage themselves. Some can malfunction to water if they are mechanical, which was a very nice touch. Other mechanical enemies can shoot a straight line, which puts emphasis on positioning, and others shoot missiles in AoE, along with combat encounters having both of them, which makes for a bigger adjustment than I've ever seen in a Trails game. Yes, including all of their bosses. This isn't even rare for Zero. Another setup right after this area was a lifesteal tank with a flying blinder. meaning it flies far and it blinds you when it hits, just for the audio viewers. As you can see, almost all of my points are aided by the addition of enemy HP, or toughness. I mentioned on my Sky video about how I wished enemies would bring more meaningful encounters, as Trails usually made a lot of enemies more one-shottable. More HP resulted in less enemy spawn. In other words, not jamming many enemies on the grid makes for the game to not revolve around AoEs as much, like it did in the later Sky games. More HP also made lingering status effects more viable, since again, enemies aren't one-shottable anymore, so it's more worth it. It also has made the obsession over attack arts fall, and draw more attention to status effects, buffs, and nerfs, and positioning for crafts. All of this to say, the increase of enemy toughness has made the Trails game more tactical and made it, in my opinion, the best combat system without a doubt to all of the games that came before it. Trails from Zero adds support characters from the last game, and the first time you do so, tangles it within story. Though simple, Third Sky lacked this, along with the combo craft that I mentioned before, which are also story connected. Another touch I liked is when entering areas with quote-unquote high spiritual energy, which are mostly referred as dungeons. These dungeons incorporate more elements, which most of the enemies are weak to. Sepith, used for orbs, is also harder to come by. Weapons and armor are especially applicable to this when it comes to Mira, which is the currency. Not only will this make the player think about what they are buying, but also provide more benefit from taking on support quests for coin instead of grinding enemies. Many times you will struggle to upgrade slots and even unlock them early on, which makes you try to make efficient combinations. The Trails game offered so many combinations without even thinking or needing to strategize because of how much orbs were given. All of this makes rewards more fulfilling since they make a big difference. For example, earning Blank Orb from a chest was a huge level up for my stats, since at that point it was super hard to even upgrade a slot. Trails, on the other hand, would have made an easy fight and given you an orbment you could have bought from the shop 4 times over. The reason I say Blank Orb is because in almost no scenario did any of the orbments I was rewarded weren't of high value to me and my party. Zero has also added a percentage of failure to escaping fights. This was a necessary implementation and really adds some sort of thought into entering fights you aren't ready for. This is especially portrayed by the percentage chance being 0% if you get ambushed, also known as being hit in the back by an enemy. Though your percentage increases 10% every time you fail, I also agree that was a good choice. When losing battles, Zero finally adds the ability to retry and retry with lower difficulty. However, I feel like returning to the spot before would have been better, which personally makes me feel that they didn't want so much of the cinematic effect to be removed by having to walk back up to the fight and already know it's coming up. Combat is also intertwined with gameplay even more in this game. Later on, you earn a summon through a mainline quest you do, which allows you to summon Zeit, a divine wolf. The use of his ability in some boss fights does not feel like a gimmick, especially through experiencing his use from the mainline quest. If you choose not to use him, this can serve as a nice raise in difficulty. Combat is also intertwined through the new combo crafts using two distinct party members, which are earned throughout the story, which by the way reminded me of Chrono Trigger. Level design is also more than passable. The most exciting level design in Zero now includes levers, keys, and obstacles to try to spice things up and progress the story without relying on having corridors filled with enemies in straight lines. No trails, just because you have a long straight line that changes directions, it does not mean you have good level design. Finally, one of the best improvements for general gameplay is the added speed up mode. This makes animations faster and allows for skip feature when performing arts. This makes the game feel great, as the game also has a setting to modify the speed multiplier. This is great, but still makes me question why I move so slow normally. What is this? I'm literally in a dream right now. This is the actual speed. Okay, anyways, overall, Trails gameplay adds new mechanics, difficulty to progression, more realistic fights, slightly more accessible fail points, more developed gameplay and story connection, and improved quality of life and level design. Next is the boss review. Though Zero has few true boss fights, I will be covering them here and commenting about how I feel about them. This will serve as a short closing to the combat section just to round it all out. I decided to write about these encounters as I fought them. Your first true boss battle is with Yin and is very cinematic, not to mention his arts animation, which is very nice. His main strategy is cloning himself until they bombard you with damage. Though I like this fight quite a bit, I don't like the fact that the solution to the boss fight is displayed so simply. After losing once from trying to take down his clones, you realize you can just focus the original and win the fight without changing your playstyle. I would have hoped for his clones to have less HP, and maybe inflict status effects or do more damage, so it would be an even balance between fighting him or the clones. As a beginning boss though, this is great. Your second boss fight is Revachol, Mafia Man again. This fight is more about dealing with a big heavy lifter. Usually S-crafts can one-shot your characters, so packing items and using defensive crafts is a good idea. In this scene, I also love the fact that Zeit was unable to be used in this fight and later arrived in the scene to aid the party, which helps connect story and combat. The third boss fight is the Archdevil. It is vital in introducing the corrupt church storyline, which I will describe later. This was generally more of an endurance fight and honestly less exciting. The next boss is like the Archdevil in how it has minions and he spawns them until you kill a certain many. This big robot is in my opinion a bit overtuned and should be a bit stronger than when you first lose to him and lower the difficulty. Overall, without the difficulty curve, the battle felt somewhat cheap, as you're mostly damaging spells to their water weakness. Doesn't do enough damage to finish them off before they heal each other or the boss. Of course you can focus on one entirely, but I feel that all the enemies needed a bit of a stat cut for it to feel fair. The worst thing a player can feel is removing the ability to beat the enemy with their tools given to them. Now for the final area of the game, the fourth is Ernest, which is accompanied by two tanky birds. I'm not sure whether it is the pressure to create a more difficult encounter, but I find it sad Trails tries to, instead of making interesting boss design later in the game, they decide to HP tank, which is unfortunately the route the Trails in the Sky took. This boss battle was basically me spamming Tio's guard, and reflect on all of my party members since his attacks were so slow. This is more disappointing since this very video earlier I said that the game doesn't rely on guard spam. The next is Garcia, the Revachol man, or the Mafia man you fight again, shortly after Ernest. This functions as more of a skill check due to his power. All the battle was attacking and managing S-crafts with heals. I really wish Trails doesn't make bosses always singular and doesn't always make them two tanky minions besides them. This boss fight, although was better than the others by a bit, pales in comparison with the first boss fight, especially since the boss fight is so much later in the game. The last boss is Joaquim. His first phase is the same as Garcia, just tankier, and once he turns into a beast, in his second phase, he comes equipped with directional attacks and slowly spawning enemies which slow you down. In the beginning of the battle, tiles do disappear from the edges, but the only thing that changes here is moving more on directional attacks, which obviously you can do anyways. Okay, so once again, this fight was too easy, an HP sponge, and designed worse than even the regular encounters you find on this field. Though I mentioned it in my last video, I would like to praise how grounded this game is. To not retread so much ground, the Sky series felt like a coming-of-age story, which was lighthearted, with adventure picking up friends to experience outside the world and become a bracer. Zero is moving into a new home alone, and trying to work a job with a group of unfamiliar faces. In Skies, it feels like Estelle wants to have fun and explore. Lloyd wants to become a good representation of his community and not waste his time to make sure that he can. What also helps is how the bracers are introduced, in which they are clearly stronger than them, and anyone but the bracers for aid is almost laughed at. In the beginning, the SSS works a long way to make themselves reputable, having to deal with the city's problems, like the corruption of gangs, missing people, and scammers. Since Trails focused on your city and makes it your hub world, places feel more real, especially in their literal qualities. For most of Zero, you will be visiting villages, hospitals, and field. Environments are calmer. Add on the fact that you will be solving problems that pale in comparison to what the bracers do, and Zero starts feeling to have an underdog tone. Traveling is less taken for granted. This is helped by the fact that you have to use the bus to travel around, and sometimes car or on foot, which I'm happy does get mentioned. Zero also has a way of tying together plot points into a big overarching plan for its main quest. Specifically, the beginning tied to its drug plot. I'll explain what I mean by this. For starters, I will be summarizing the story very quickly and also trying to include the way it ties the points. So, the story starts with two gangs fighting with each other about their damaged gang members, but don't realize it was the Mafia who was setting them up. After laying traps at a certain time, you ambush them and discover their plan after connecting some dots which weren't brought to light earlier, but I'll let it slide for the introduction to the story. These dots are that a certain competitor, Hayu, a newly moved crime syndicate, is now head-to-head with Revachol, or the Mafia. So the Revachol decided to frame both gangs so they can later grab them to increase their size. This serves as an introduction to Hayu and Revachol and their ongoing fight for control, and also shows Lloyd's skills as he is, after all, a detective. Through another quest, you discover that Yin, an assassin, is working for Hayu. To summarize, a threat letter is sent to a certain dancer in the entertainment district, signed by Yin. After chasing after her, you realize it was a ploy to distract the people and murder the mayor of the city. The person was revealed to be the secretary. However, the secretary was reporting to be acting weird and violent. If this sounds very strange to you, I can assure you I'll cover it. Later, you describe a monster attack, which people described as wolves. After getting a story or myth from the mayor, you find out through clues that it was actually black wolves ordered by the Mafia so they can use it on their opposition. Revachol supposedly wanting to test these wolves and their new ability. After you find what is called Jaquim, a missing doctor, which is found fishing on his job time, this of course serves as the introduction of the character, and judging by the slow pace of the story, doesn't tip too much of his involvement in the grand scheme of things. The game finally raises some tension and a mission you told you were not to mess with. Opportunity gets the best of you, which was a result of the introduction of Ren's character arc, a character from the past games. She recounts her traumatic experience and how she thought her family left her. For consoling her, she gives you the opportunity to enter an undercover auction through your invitation cards. After entering the auction, you then hear a voice which coincides with people talking about a very expensive doll. Yin then attacks the auction and informs you to look for the doll, which you then find a little girl who couldn't remember anything called Kay. What follows is an escape sequence and a reveal who Randy is while fighting the Mafia boss Garcia, a second in command to Revachol. This was foreshadowed when Randy and Joshua had a race and had a certain power he activated during the game, hinting Joshua was familiar to, because of his background as a Jaeger. Quite a moment after this, after Hayu fights back with Yin against Revachol, Revachol decides to use a trump card to even their odds, which destroys them in a raid. After the fallout, you are called to discover ruins that are reported to have ghosts in them, and where you fight the Archdevil. Tio then reports that these were used as places to offer children as sacrifices, and introduces these things to the story. This part of the story finally ends with you checking up on a gambler sent to Crossbill for the week, and a stockbroker as well, which has been seen having extreme luck and a change in personality, which follows you discovering drugs in his belongings, which finally ties all these happenings having to do with the substance together. And after people go missing, you search into Revachol's stronghold and find out how they were ordering this drug from the cult members from the ruins you discovered, and that Tio had a personal experience with, which slowly has been foreshadowed as Tio in your party feels frail whenever mentioning the cult members and goes through an arc regarding her past with them, which I'll cover more in detail. What might seem as a random catch to connect some story points, it isn't so much of a reach, since we after all can tell that Revachol has been selling their products to citizens like lab rats, kind of like they trained their dogs with the drug to test their power. Though these do seem to connect, this is not to say Zero does a perfect job of doing so. A major flaw in Zero is its inability to develop and introduce overarching narratives, or plots into its story within its main quest, without making it seem spontaneous and random. One instance would be the doctor quest. You know this doctor called Joachim since he has been helping you analyze the blue pills, or the drug that makes people act sporadically, or fall under control of a person administering them, and earlier did a quest for him to hunt him down as he had gone fishing, on the job. I appreciate the casualness of this quest and how it introduces the physician, but this quest seems to serve as nothing but an introduction and nothing about his character, or any foreshadowing, which really rubs me the wrong way. Another instance would be the murder plan on the mayor, which was revealed in a sentence nonchalantly by a reporter. I can't deliver it any justice, so here's the plot reveal.
でも手がかりが欲しいんです。だから。
でもエリーちゃんも。私はどまい。私が追っていたネタは市長アーネストって言ったっけ。市長に内緒で事務所の資金を勝手に最近じゃ帝国派議員と密談してまさか市長を亡き者にってもしこの状況で
目撃者さえ作らなければ 犯人は別のやつにそれが
Not only is this reveal ridiculous, but after you learn he is one of the villain's subordinates, this is even worse when you are introduced to him even earlier as a loyal secretary to Ellie's grandfather, as again, it comes out of left field. After all this transpires, the story reaches its ending. After tons of people missing, you go to the hospital and find Ernest who fights you. And after saving refugees found at the hospital with Revache attacked, you then meet Joachim the doctor, in which he leaves a book for you that contains information that a speaker from Crossbell called Hartman was being blackmailed into helping procure the drugs from a supplier. You also find kids that were used in the rituals by the cults, including Tio, and having a big photo of Kay. I wonder what that means. Anyways, after hiding in the IBC, Joachim attacks and begs for Kay to return to them. Us still not knowing her purpose and fending them off, attacking the enemies causes us to realize he can control people from a distance. Coincidentally, the Braziers know the cult's location, in which you go to through an escape sequence to get there. I like how these action sequences can be done more cinematically, since, if this was Trail's game, the only cinematics would have been fighting animations. After going through the so-called Sun Tower, as it is named, you find the missing people and Ernest, who transforms into a monster as his final form. I really appreciate being able to fight him early on until you get to his final form. Unfortunately so, Zero seems to have always held a trigger with character deaths in general, which I always found to be a bit silly, especially in comparison to how dull the mood is in Zero than in Trails. This is followed up by Garcia, who was strong enough to resist the demon transformation. Finally, you encounter the Doctor, which unfortunately goes over too much of the edge with exposition and plan dump into how all the threads tie in together. Judging by Zero's playtime averaging 40 hours, I really don't think this was necessary. I would have appreciated more if we found out more about Joachim as the game progressed instead of all of his ideas being compounded into one scene. He explains that Kay was stored for 500 years in an orb and that she is the divine child, and possesses powers one can dream of, and calls her a god. What's more terrible is the writing here, or more of it. Technically, they manufacture a friendship is magic scene, and then, after another brink of death cutscene, Ren appears to give help, in which you then finish them off. The Braziers then celebrate how Ren is truly close to them no matter her past, and actually does care for them like they care for her, and finally decides to become part of the family. I'm purposely skimming Ren's arc and most character arcs, since most of it takes place in the past games and this game also has a sequel. After this, Elle and Joshua return to Liberal with Ren, and you get a cinematic summary, which reminds me of Fallout and I thought was done nicely. The last shot we get is us sending Kay off to school, which I thought was cute and in my opinion done way better than Trails FC or SC. To conclude, Zero improves on all of its combat systems and combat encounters excluding bosses, in which it fails the most of all Sky games in relation to how good its combat actually is when utilizing them correctly. Level design is more thought out than all of the entries I'd say combined, and the story is more mature, but some plot threads still come out of nowhere by pure convenience. Honestly, too convenient is my problem. The characters in Trail are a step down from the Sky games, but we do have a localized sequel coming to Steam soon. I still think this is the best Trails by just a little bit. And those are my thoughts on Zero. If you like this video, subscribe as I make critiques and essay reviews on any game that I decide to play, and if you have any criticism, I'd appreciate it on thumbnails, the way I represented story, combat, gameplay, or anything else you can think of. My next review will be on Azure, or maybe some other game, but I'm not really sure since I am, after all, waiting for the game to come out.